Hello, it is Jason Glazer talking about SPC 229 schema data groups. This time we're covering ASHRAE 229 root data group, the Ruleset Model Instance, the building data group, and the building segment data group. Remember, for the first week after the video is posted, we encourage discussion by email of any issues found. Hopefully, all issues are identified during that week. After that, we will have a letter ballot, which will also last 1 week. If minor issues are raised during the discussion, then those will be included in the letter ballot. But if something is more complicated, then it will be referred back to the schema working group and brought up again in a future ballot. This video is covering the root, or top, of the schema hierarchy. All data groups that we have previously discussed fall somewhere under these root data groups. In many respects, you will probably have few surprises of what these root data groups contain. Many of the reasons for the data groups to be under different data groups have resulted in discussions from the schema working group debating on how things should be organized. There are probably dozens of alternative approaches, but I think we ended up with a good approach that's reasonable and allows for a logical expansion in the future. Remember that the schema is intended to aid in validating that a transformation between the user's model and the baseline model is done correctly, and is not intended to be a universal model of everything that can appear in a building or be modeled by a simulation program. So let's start with the data groups. So the first thing we're going to cover is this ASHRAE 229 data group. You may notice that this diagram is arranged a little differently than the last version, and that's because it's automatically created every time the schema is updated. So it's rearranged slightly because of some other changes that were made to the schema. Two of the child data groups to this root ASHRAE 229 group is the weather and the calendar data group. We've actually covered both of these before, way back in January. So hopefully you remember what they are, but they pretty much are what they describe there. The only other data group that's really a child of this is the RulesetModelInstance, and we'll be talking about that today as well. Now, the RulesetModelInstance has a bunch of children data groups that we've talked about, including just recently, such as the boiler and the external fluid source, and it also covers chiller, fluid loop, that kind of thing, as well as transformer. But one thing that we haven't talked about yet, but we'll be talking about today, is that it also covers the building itself. And the building has a lot of children also. Its children are primarily based on the building segment, and then other aspects of the building that may be larger than the segment, such as refrigerated cases. For convenience, you might want to think about the ASHRAE 229 and the RulesetModelInstance as closely related data groups. At one point, they were just a single data group, and we've decided to split them. And similarly, the building and building segment at one point were a single data group that we've split. So that's for specific organizational reasons, and we'll get to those in a little while. So let's dive in. So the ASHRAE 229 data group is what we're going to start with. Now this is the root data group. So the basis of every RMD file is going to be one of these ASHRAE 229 data groups. And it has a ID, reporting name, and notes, just like all the others have allowed. But primarily, it's made up of the Ruleset model instances. And I think we've talked about a little bit earlier already that calendar and weather were part of it. There's also a compliance path enumeration and also an output format type. So let's start with rule set model instances. I usually don't read these notes, but I think it's a pretty good summary, and I'll read just part of it. For submissions with rule set model instances generated as separate files, only one instance would be defined for each ASHRAE229 RMD JSON file. For submissions where software is always produced by rule set instances together, multiple rule set instances would appear in the same RMD file. Some rule sets may restrict the submission process, including the number of files and the number of instances per file. For Appendix G, we'd expect that there'd actually be several different files, each one containing just a single instance. So there'd be a file for the user model, another file for the proposed model, a baseline at 0 degrees and 90 degrees, another for 180 degrees, and finally one more for 270 degrees building rotations. So basically, for ASHRAE 90.1 Appendix G, you'd probably have you'd have a bunch of files, each one containing one instance. But for other situations, you might have a single file that contains multiple instances. And this is probably the most likely to happen when the software generates a single piece of software generates all the instances. So this might apply to Title 24 or ResNet in the future. So let me dive a little bit into the two enumerations, compliance path and output format type. You might notice that these are actually enumerations that are rule set specific. So let's give you an example of how they would look with 90.1 Appendix G. So for compliance path options, basically there'd be code compliant level and beyond code level options. And for the output schema, basically there'd be just one option for 90.1 output schema, and that would be the schema format for that. So output schema ASHRAE 90.1 2019. I would expect that most output schemas are going to be a single option. So the next data group is RulesetModelInstance. And again, it has the same ID, reporting name, and notes that most of the data groups have had. And just to remind you again, this data group repeats if multiple sets of simulation results are in the same file. This would occur when a rule set software is very tightly linked and controlled, such as for Title 24 or ResNet. For rule sets like Appendix G, there's likely to be only one of these data groups in each separate RMD file. So it generally contains stuff that might be broader than a building, but might apply to multiple buildings in a campus situation. So the first thing is a enumeration called rule set model type. We'll talk about that soon. And then similar to if there was a campus of buildings, there might be a transformer that applies to the site, a list of the buildings that are on the site. Now, for a typical model, there's only one building, and so there'd probably be only a list of one. There'd be the schedules that are used by the building. And then we have a few things having to do with infiltration, the measured infiltration pressure difference, and if the measured infiltration is based on a test. So basically these are measurements of air leakage at specific pressures, which usually are either at 50 pascals or 75 pascals, or perhaps the actual amount if it's based on an actual test. So the first value could be any number, and then the if it's based on a measurement or not would be either true or false. Then we have a list of things that are used in other places in the model. So there'd be fluid loops, service distribution systems, service water heating equipment, pumps, boilers, chillers, heat rejection, external fluid source. So some of these we've seen already and some we'll be seeing in upcoming videos. But basically, they're mostly just a holder for things that don't necessarily belong as children of other things, but are basically a system loop kinds of arrangements and those pieces that fit on those loops. And then finally, the site zone type, which is another enumeration. So I'll go into those now. So the rule set model options. Now these are, again, these are 90.1 Appendix G specific ones, but we'd expect that each rule set that used this schema would have their own list of rule set model options. But basically, these are user proposed and then the 4 baseline rotations for an Appendix G. And then the external the exterior lighting zone options. This is table 9.4.2-1 in Appendix G in 90.1, and I think it actually appears in other rule sets as well. But basically, it's basically describing what the surrounding area is as far as the level of light and its development. This is, I believe, based on another standard. So the next data group is building. So let's talk about that. Again, ID and reporting name and notes, that's stuff we've seen before. And the next thing is building segments. So basically, building and building segments are ways of describing the building in totality. Large portions of a building that share a building area type, such as office and warehouse, would each be represented by a segment. So for many buildings, there might just be one segment. But for buildings that are multiple use, then they'd end up with 2 or more segments. And then there's several lists of things that are building specific. So there'd be elevators, exterior lights and refrigerated cases when the building is open. So that would basically be the official hours for how the building is operated. And we understand that some buildings that are multi-use might have segments with different hours, but we decided that we'd have generally that there was a building open schedule for most buildings that has to do with when that building is open. And then finally, whether that building has any kind of site shading. So basically, does anything cast a shadow on the building? So, and that's just a yes or no question for now. So the next one, and I apologize, this one is got a very small font, is building segment. So as I said, many buildings will only have one segment, but others will have multiple segments. And the reason this is important is that a lot of rule sets and building codes have different requirements for different building types. And so that's why it's broken into segments. Again, it's the ID, reporting name, and notes at the top. And then we have a number of floors above grade and below grade. So this would just be a numerical result just to indicate how many are above and below grade. Finally, another input is a Boolean called is all new. So A Boolean like this would indicate whether the building segment is completely new construction or if it's existing building. So for an addition, for example, the addition itself would be shown as new, so it would be true, but the rest of the building might be in another building segment and be indicated as false. So this is just one application of building segments. Within each building segment, finally, is zones. So there's obviously a lot of details that go into zone and data groups below that. Then there's also heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems. So that's a gateway to all the basically the air side and the water side of the systems. There's an area type for vertical fenestration, lighting building area type, and an area type for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. So these are 3 more enumerations that I'll be going through. But basically, they are different ways to describe the categorization for each building segment. So let's go into those next. So the first one is vertical fenestration building area. So these are, you maybe see these as familiar. They're from Appendix G, Table G311-1. And basically, they're all the building types that are used for determining the amount of vertical fenestration area that's allowed for that building, for the baseline building model. The next one is the lighting space options. Oops, this one. So these are all the space types that are allowed, and this is reflective of Appendix G, Table G3-8. And keep in mind that I think all rule sets are going to have some details like this. They may not use all of them, but probably most of them will at least be using this lighting space options. So if you look through, these are all the different spaces that have different lighting levels in Appendix G. And then the last one is heating, ventilation, air conditioning, building area options. And these are basically related to Table G311-3 as well as some of the exceptions. So there's residential, public assembly, retail, hospital, and other non-residential. So I think that's all the enumerations that I wanted to go through. And that was the last building data group is a building segment that I wanted to cover. So thank you for watching the video. As a reminder, if you have questions or comments on the schema, please reply to everyone with your comments, and hopefully it can be resolved as part of the ballot. About a week after this video is released, you should be receiving a letter ballot from ASHRAE. So please vote on that letter ballot when you receive it. So thank you very much.